Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Walk, Talk, and Rock. It is I, Xaiyeon, and today we're just gonna talk about what's trending right now because there's not really much that I want to talk about other than see. There's some games that I'm waiting for, like Trails in the Sky second chapter. Let's go. I really love the first one. The remaster was great. And then what else? What else? Yeah, I can't really think of any games right now. I used to watch all the trailers, but lately, I don't know if you've been noticing, E3, I mean, not sorry, E3, Game Awards and other shows like CES and stuff, they've been pretty much the same. But today, let's talk about Lord of the Rings. Recently announced that we just had some sort of shadow drop of a trailer of Lord of the Rings of the North, you know, War in the North. And that got me thinking, like, wow, they really need to bring that series back because I think Lord of the Rings really pioneered that adventure trope, especially when it came to drama. It was a good show. I mean, movie. So we'll just talk about that one. So, what I want to discuss about Lord of the Rings, which is basically, you know, an IP franchise that helped define modern fantasy because it had not only like Frodo and collecting rings, it really established that world building of many different races that you see in modern games like Final Fantasy 14, such as like dwarves, elves, minotaurs, gremlins, goblins, and things like that. But I'm pretty sure they were well established already in the past. So we have like things such as the quest and definitely a lot of politics that really brought the story together, with all the races fighting and things like that. So for this one, I'm going to be talking about what makes Lord of the Rings important as a defining genre and how it could come into. I mean, they were already going to make some games based on Lord of the Rings, but I feel like a lot of them are pretty old now. And I think the recent one was just kind of mid. Then we'll talk about the movies itself, why Peter Jackson's trilogy worked. Like the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and Return of the King. It really transformed Tolkien's books into one cinematic journey. And it was very exciting, even though the movies were long, 3 hours or so. It was so enjoyable because it felt like, honestly, it just felt like a fantasy vlog or something. And then we have the history of the Lord of the Rings games. I'm just going to mention some of the games for Lord of the Rings. And then we'll talk about why Lord of the Rings is perfect for RPGs and even MMO. There was an MMO. And then lastly, what should the ultimate Lord of the Rings game be? Or anything. I feel like even as technology progresses, we can definitely have some things from Lord of the Rings, except for the magic, or we can have technology as magic. I don't know. It's something to talk about. And then my opinions and how they can extend the Lord of the Rings franchise, in my opinion. Like, they can literally make a show out of Lord of the Rings. Like, it could definitely be a spin off, you know? A spin off to the series, each focusing on the characters, such as a prequel, like what Red Dead Redemption does. They could do prequels of the point leading to their adventure, or they could just do a sequel after their adventure, where Frodo and all the other people, Legolas and stuff, live individual lives and raise a family, and there could be more conflicts. But it's also in alignment with other series like Game of the Thrones, which was a very powerful series as well, except for the last season. So let's get started. So for this main part, I just wanted to talk about how in Lord of the Rings and why it's important, because everybody has a clear defined role. And in this one, you didn't really need to guess what each character did, because kind of, well, even what their race and how they are greatly ties in to that. So like you have the elves, dwarves, wizards, dark lords, orcs, enemies, and all that. And if we were to break up the book, even if you've never read the novel or watched the movies, anybody that can analyze how most video games are, especially JRPGs or RPGs in general, you always have certain people in your JRPG, which in contrast makes a story move on. You have Aragon, who's like the Ranger Warrior. You have like Legolas, he's the range DPS. You have Gimli, who could be a tank or bruiser. You have Gandalf, mage, wizard, support. You have Boromir, a heavy warrior. And you have Frodo, who's basically just like a merchant or charismatic type leader, basically a jack of all trades, excuse me. Then you have Sam, who's kind of like a chef or healer or whatever. So the Fellowship looks like somebody, or maybe the author, was thinking about having it like an RPG party, and it's probably almost related to a similar fantasy, guys. A similar game that almost has the same exact setup. And dare I say that is Final Fantasy. So like Lord of the Rings, oh my god, it's from 1937. I take that back. I would have to say Final Fantasy was probably based on Lord of the Rings. I take that back. Damn. That is crazy. I'm surprised how long Lord of the Rings franchise has been going on. Hopefully they can keep it going, I guess. Since I wasn't really born that far back, I'm not really too sure what kind of things Lord of the Rings could be based on. So it probably got inspired from definitely ancient mythologies, and I think that's about it. And I guess the story came about just as naturally as someone would think about like that context of Super Mario. You take X, you go to Y, and you do this. So I guess that makes sense. And the cool thing about Lord of the Rings is it has a very expansive world, right? In the movies, and they're traveling, there are so many different kind of biomes and places that really set the defining tone. Like the more famous scenes, such as the Elf Village. The Elf Village. Shoot, what is that called? Rivendell. I believe that's the scene. The one with the high elves. That was so beautiful. And to think that was made before a lot of CGI was implemented. That's just insane. Like, who knows, right? That is a crazy, crazy set. So still on this part about Lord of the Rings. Each character even has their own different morals and dynamics that set them apart. And you have all these little personal space and stories for each character. That it, even if Lord of the Rings adapted to say the way that Alice created the metaphor of Refantasio, I would feel that gameplay style would totally fit into Lord of the Rings because you can build relationships with those characters as you go through your adventure. Like Atlas needs to Sega Atlas needs to partner up with whoever. I mean, I should just look right now. Owners. Who owns Lord of the Rings right now? Oh, it's split between the Swedish media company. So like multiple people basically own IP rights to Lord of the Rings. But they should definitely ask Sega Atlas to remake the entire Lord of the Rings story into that gameplay. Because it would fit so perfectly, right? You would have your day and night cycle and your adventure. And you can still have that turn-based feel, which would totally make sense for Lord of the Rings. We don't really need all that action, but they could, because the games that they've made before have decent action. All right. So with that, it fits perfectly with the tarot cards too, because they have things about power, corruption, morality, friendship, industrialization, nature, sacrifice, temptation. So if the people that made Metaphor Refantasio, which is a game from Alice, decide to take on the creation of an RPG based on Lord of the Rings IP, I think that would be a successful venture, both business-wise and fan-wise, for the franchise itself. Don't quote me on that one. I wish somebody would take that idea seriously. And even the setting of Middle Earth really gives you a story that can tell a thousand years, in my opinion. And it's a really well crafted environment or place. So I guess for this part, if they did make a game on that, which part of Middle Earth would be a nice location that you'd like to explore? You know, it can range from the Shire, Rivendell, Gondor, Rohan, and those places. And then, as Peter Jackson had completely reasonable task of turning his, novel book into a movie. So we'll talk about the Lord series movies right here. The movies and series is basically is trilogy. And in the trilogy, we have the Fellowship of the Ring, the beginning. And then we have basically, I guess, the turning point, the two towers. And then we have the climax, the return of the king, which all of the movies are freaking phenomenal. I think back then, honestly though, well, without the widespread use of social media and being able to share many stories, I think that the only reason why Lord of the Rings got so much care and dedication into it is because of the exposure it had and because of the connections people had back then in the past, such as with like Hollywood. Everyone had the central powers, and things today are more divided. So you have a lot of different hubs of publishing companies versus back then when you had a central one that really took only one idea and really pushed it into the media. So I think that's why, even though Lord of the Rings is kind of good, even maybe in today's standards compared to other shows, it might be on par or even less because it's really a simple story. It's nothing too crazy, but it's mostly about the adventure. With anything, when you build a story where you see characters go through hardships, they always have that camaraderie and relationship stuff. And if you're just invested or reading and thinking about it, obviously it's not that difficult for anybody to be convinced that this is a story to look out for. And that's what I really think about Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's nothing really special if you really think about it. But back then, it was a novel idea because of probably education and how the media pushed. But what made these work is, they had the Shire, Rivendell, and all those beautiful places in there. And in the movies, you would know it's fake, obviously, because it's made back then. But they really made good use of practical techniques and the digital effects. There was some CGI, obviously, but they still had that natural look of, of just being a really good and eye-appealing capture or cinematic. Because they had miniatures, minotaurs, goblins, prosthetics. Definitely had a ton of sets. But like I said, back then, there wasn't really a whole multitude of shows compared to today. Even with a lot of big name shows that we had running at the same time, like The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, Stranger Things, and so many more. Like Big Bang Theory, Silicon Valley. See how many shows were simultaneously running, and it spreads a lot of manpower throughout that industry. We'll just call it the entertainment consumption industry or whatever. For TV shows and movies. So for the first movie, for the Fellowship and all that stuff, we really got laid down the groundwork for every character. We had several parallel stories with like Frodo and Sam. They're basically together as buddies, best friend, whatever. Then you have like Aragorn becoming king, and you have like Gandalf's return when he was shown from the beginning and then missing towards the end of the Twin Towers and whatnot. And you have Golem, my precious, oh my precious, and all these other characters that just live their own story or life within the movie, or however you want to say, trilogy book. And they just sort of converge. But this is only possible because I feel like the story was written in a way that's backwards. And when you already define the goal of your story, it's really easy to add things that lead up to it. Because you can literally just throw in anything, right? When you're a story writer, when you already define how your story ends, you can just keep adding and adding and adding to delay that gratification of your story ending. But for Lord of the Rings, they do a very good job with that element. And even the foreshadowing is kind of obvious, right? You know, when they're signaling things where they're gonna go. I mean, it's basically literally straightforward. You don't really need to think about it. They literally tell you where they're gonna go next, and all you have to do is just witness that task happen, right? Other things we have is like the Hobbit discussion. You know, this is more of the political take in the movie with all the races and land getting taken over. It's very divisive because, you know, that's the whole reason why Frodo and Sam are venturing and finding the ring, right? To basically unite the lands or something with all the kingdoms and races. So what I think what's coming next for 2026 and beyond is maybe they're going to be expanding the storyline as they have been doing right now, because we have some hint of like Lord of the Rings going to the hunt for Golem as far as movies are concerned. And Andy Serkis is directing several of the characters connected to the project. And we're gonna have stuff like Lord of the Rings Shadows of the Past, such a very generic title in my opinion. It's very self-explanatory. And I guess they're gonna have the ball rolling again for the Lord of the Rings franchise. I think though it mostly appeals to more of the older generation of human beings in today's modern world, and less more so from the more recent generations like Gen Z, Alpha, and Beta, and soon to be Gamma, right? Is it Gamma? Wow, amazing. So my question is like, do you think we actually need more movies for Lord of the Rings, or think it's a done deal? I mean, you can literally take that story and write it so many ways with different characters. And, you know, there's a lot of anime shows that kind of have that kind of theme. Like, I watch anime, so I'm just going to compare it to anime. And more so, we don't really have many shows today that have that fantasy and overworldly theme. Now that I kind of think about it, you know, what other shows do we have that have this very fantasy-like setting? Not very many. So I think it's probably IP locked, you know, copyrighted, based in similar settings or something as. Who knows? It's not like everybody writes the same story. Everybody has their own idea to tell a story. So then, the original trilogy already feels complete, like I said, which makes every new movie kind of like lukewarm, honestly, and not as exciting as the first one, because now it feels like you're just dragging the shit on like Bleach. You know, it should have ended when they defeated Aizen, or even in Naruto. You know, should have ended after that one war with the 1,000 ninjas or whatever. Like those series should have ended at certain points, but you know they just wanted to do it for the fans, which is for the fans, but it destroys the integrity of a really good ending for a series, in my opinion. But anyways, which movie of the trilogy did you enjoy the most? You know, was it The Fellowship of the Ring, The Twin Towers, or The Return of the King? Let me know. So, where Middle Earth gets really interesting for us in games, you know, versus movies, because this world practically begs you to stop watching and start exploring. So, of course, over these past decades, we've had many games inspired by Lord of the Rings. And I kind of feel like Elder Scrolls is kind of inspired by Elder Rings. Lord of the Rings, sorry. That's probably not true. But anyways, we have some important games like the Two Towers, the Return of the King, and this is by EA, I guess. You have like actual replayable movie battles in the game, which is super cool. You get to see Helm's Deep, Minas Tirith, orcs everywhere, and it has some sort of progression, leveling up and unlocking abilities. These games weren't trying to create their own game, they're trying to be faithful to the source material, which is mostly the book. And then you have like the Battle for Middle Earth, which was mostly based on real-time strategy. You build armies, you control heroes and all that. So they had all different kinds of different genres for helping boost the Lord of the Rings franchise, which is really good. And I think that any kind of work done for Lord of the Rings just really boosts its reputation as being that one premier fantasy defining genre, Like Lord of the Rings is literally defined fantasy for so many things these days that it's hard to not see some influence of it in other media, but I'm always wrong because we had Studio Ghibli and their shows, which they could also be inspired by Lord of the Rings in a way. And then more notably, we had the game War in the North, which is really underrated. It was a co-op action RPG that had so many cool things going for it. Being released in about 2011. It was really one of those games that you would really invest your time into. But then comes the really ultimate game right here, Shadow of Mordor. That's right. It literally took the monolith of the entire Middle Earth and they turned it into a system that they called the Nemesis system, like a custom proprietary game engine almost, but it was a series of gameplay mechanics that seriously, it was mind-blowing back in the day. Like Shadow of Mordor, such a good game, y'all. And I think that if you haven't played it, you seriously have to. Shadow of Mordor and even Shadow of War. They are extremely good games. And I really hope that they revive, or whoever worked on that game. Let me see who worked on that one. Monolith Productions and Warner Brothers. Damn, but it was basically its own thing. It wasn't really directly tied to Lord of the Rings, but I believe it's more so inspired as like I said, a spin-off. But holy shit, I wish they would bring that system back into modern gaming today. Like, I don't know what they're doing. I guess the original developers either passed away or retired. But man, if I was a billionaire, I would pay them at least $10 billion. Sorry, that's too much. Probably at least $2 billion. Try to make the next sequel to that series, Middle Earth series. I guess that's what we call it, because Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, Middle Earth, God, such a great game. Because then later in Shadow of War, they expanded the idea with fortresses, large armies, orc recruitment, siege battles. It was really your fantasy RPG to go to. Aside from like Skyrim afterwards, Skyrim, Elder Scrolls really took the throne on that one after Lord of the Rings had its glory. So, with the Nemesis system, actually one of the most important open world innovations of the last decade. I think so. I felt like the Nemesis system added so much, especially to open world RPGs. I mean, the only competing series we have is like Elder Scrolls when it comes to open world fantasy games. I would put Final Fantasy in there a little bit. For the most part, Final Fantasy is more of a linear game. No shade to Square Enix. But I guess Final Fantasy 14 would fit that category. But it's more different when you're making a truly open world with dynamic driven events. So I guess like Final Fantasy 14 would also fill that void. As well as the older MMOs like World of Warcraft, that would also fill in that void. So we've really had a lot of fantasy. Fantasy is just a really popular genre if you think about it. Very dominant genre when it comes to RPGs and movies. Fantasy is the way to go. Like, we can never go wrong with fantasy. Even science fiction fantasy, or fantasy in space, you just can never go wrong with putting some fantasy in your work of art or whatever. So after Shadow of the War, we had Tales of the Shire, which was recently released in the past few years, which mostly focuses on the cozy hobbit, cooking, gathering, fishing, and whatnot. And I guess the world was strong enough about being a hobbit because it was more like of a slice of life game, I guess. Let me look at it more. Yeah, it was more like a slice of life game. It wasn't too crazy. But the ratings for it were phenomenal. It almost has a 4.5 out of 5 stars. And it's available on Steam, so you can check that game out too. If you're more into casual games, but still want to have the Lord of the Rings experience. Of Middle Earth and all that. And then aside from that, we don't really have anything. So when an IP works as both a game or like a simulator, for slaying orcs left and right, and even being used as some sort of farming or life simulator, that's pretty a strong world, But in reality, it's its own world. It basically takes real life things and just makes it into its own fantasy setting. So I wouldn't really praise it in that direction as for creativity and innovation. So what do you think, in your opinion, was the best, I guess, Lord of the Rings inspired game? Did you like Lord of the Rings RTS, Return of the King, Shadow of War, Shadow of Mordor? Let me know. And now this is where we turn our real arguments of Middle Earth and why it can still be an even better RPG setting. Because with the recently released game like Elden Ring, we were thinking, people were discussing about maybe it's time to revive the Nemesis system, or they could just make something else that's brand new and better. It's not like it was that unique anyways. It was just different. But there's a lot of really interesting ways these days in some games, such as The Witcher. What else? Cyberpunk. Okay, that's literally just one studio I'm naming. Like, damn, they should probably just have CD Projekt Red combined with From Software. And like I said, Atlas. triple contract on bringing the best complete Lord of the Rings RPG. Can you imagine that? That would be insane. Because I mean, even independent studios like the previously successful Larian Studios, Baldur's Gate 3. Can you imagine if that studio, instead of making Baldur's Gate 3, they made like Lord of the Rings, like their interpretation of it? Bro, that would have been. I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 was super successful. But man, they would have taken Lord of the Rings to new heights with what they did with Baldur's Gate. You know, it's almost the same theme. That's all I'm trying to say, because they both emphasize their own different power fantasy theme. Because you know, like in Baldur's Gate 3, we had a lot of different races and different kinds of people, a lot of conflicting ideas, and it just flowed really well because everybody was aligned with one single threat, which is basically kind of like the same story with you know, Lord of the Rings. So nothing too crazy there, but I think it would work in Lord of the Rings' favor. If they were to make another game like that, you know, maybe a turn-based adventure game, like I said. But there's just so many ways to approach um, a Lord of the Series game these days that I feel like anything of the magnitude would just be good for it. So here we go. Like I said, what would fit, you know, the RPG, you could be whatever race you want it to be. We'll just talk about some simple game design concepts and a little bit of planning, whatever. So you can select your race, you know, human, elf, dwarf, or hobbit, and you have like their little origin story for like the first chapter. And as the chapters go on, you start converging with the other heroes towards your adventure. And I feel like you shouldn't be the main character. You should be one of the characters, part of the main character's group. So you just like witness the story from a different POV. You know what I'm saying? Kind of like with Baldur's Gate 3, you know, you had different POVs of what other people think, and you're just experiencing everybody's problems and stuff. And I feel like that would really greatly help expand the lore of Lord of the Rings, and it would just be such an incredible game. You know what I'm saying? Like, can you just think about how much lore you would be learning from every character and the quests you could be doing? Like, it's gonna be a lot of effort, of course. You know, people have to put a lot of time into developing the game, but I really think that this way you can see many different sides of the adventure instead of just you know, a few select characters. So after, you know, you do your origin story for your race, you know, like the elves, dwarves, or whatever, and then you start converging into when Frodo, maybe you just run into them on your little adventure or something, or when they visit your town, so you could be doing some other things, and you probably hear stories about them, and you have like the whole political climate, you know, being witnessed at your race's point of view until you actually meet them. And then with that, you would have all those different classes that you see in Lord of the Rings, like a ranger, warrior, hunter, lore master, minstrel, warden, mage, whatever, and many more. I mean, it could be based on the Lord of the Rings MMO, because there was an MMO for that one that wasn't really active that long, which is the Lords of the Ring Online. Damn, it was by Amazon Games, but I guess it was canceled or something. But they had a classic one, so I guess Amazon Games is trying to revive or remaster the original, which they didn't end up doing. Because I feel bad for Amazon Games, you know. They had really good game titles when they started out the studio, like New World, Lost Ark, which are really, really good games. It's just very grindy. And some other failed games that they try to do, like an FPS and their MOBA, and then even when Blue Protocol was not doing so hot. So yeah, I don't know what's next for Amazon Games, but at least they tried. And I really enjoyed Throne of Liberty, but you know, I just kind of, well, me personally, I just kind of, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the games, except that it's kind of pay to win. You know, I don't really like pay to win that much. I felt like the game itself is good, but the approach and execution of a lot of business tactics is not really making the game fun. And remember, everybody, the reason why we play games is to have fun. Like when a game starts becoming a chore, and what's the other world, and you just like, if you're losing in a game and you're losing in real life, it's not even fun. All right, like I don't like being poor in real life and being poor in a game and just getting absolutely destroyed. The fuck. Anyways, I digress. With this super RPG of Lord of Rings, this should not even have fast travel. I'm not even sure if Skyrim also had fast travel. I think it did. But I guess 2 main cities you can unlock, like a waypoint or teleport. Kind of similar to Dragon's Dogma 2. Another cool JRPG RPG from Capcom. Now, we had so many good games recently that really raised the bar. And recently, most notably, you know, Crimson Desert of this year. That game is an absolute gem. I really enjoyed playing Crimson Desert. It was extremely fun. I just wish the story was better. Like if Crimson Desert maybe gave you more customization and personalization with your character and had a more similar story to, like, you know, obviously Lord of the Rings. Holy, Crimson Desert would have really been like a game of the year or game of the decade, like 100%. That game had so many features. It was super polished, super fun, but man, the story kind of sucked. You know, it went too hard on the nonsense, which is okay, I guess. No, that's not okay. I guess they wanted it to be unique, but it wasn't unique at all. It was just kind of stupid, right? You know, you want to be unique, but not too unique, and you don't want to be too crazy. But that game literally just took crazy to a whole nother level. It's like they put in a prompt into any LLM like Gemini or ChatGPT, and it hallucinated towards the end, because that's literally what the game felt like, right? You had a really kind of solid starting point, and as the story progressed, it was like you got dementia or some shit, and it doesn't really make that much sense. I mean, it makes sense, but the way it was executed doesn't make sense. But with this game, you know, for Lord of the Rings, it would make sense because it can still follow the source material and offer so much. You know, kind of like Elden Ring, but I would imagine that it would more likely closely follow in gameplay like Octopath Travelers. So we have so many different games right now that have been executed differently in telling their story. I think the new Lord of the Rings RPG can totally take, and remake some ideas from all these games I mentioned that can not only set it apart, but really fulfill that fantasy of experiencing Middle Earth in a new and interesting way, right? So it would be so perfect for all those things that I just mentioned. And if they were to make Lord of the Rings again, honestly, just copy Final Fantasy 14. Final Fantasy 14 is literally a perfect MMO in my opinion. When it comes to story, when it comes to content, because it's sorry, like some other people say, MMOs that are vertical get boring, but MMOs that are horizontal and scale horizontally, with their content, it's much better because you can still have a lively world and still add more features. So, like literally, Final Fantasy 14 would fit that bill. If Lord of the Rings were to revive as an MMORPG, they have crafting, raids, social hubs, and all that beautiful stuff. And it just makes sense. Like those two, honestly, World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy 14, they're really define the MMORPG genre. And nothing has really came close to those two. Not even China has an MMORPG that comes close to those. I mean, I wouldn't say Where Winds Meet count or all their different variations of wuxia MMOs because all of them fall flat, with the way they're designed just for maximum profit. So I don't really think that much about them. And most of the wuxia games fail or shut down in like a few years for some reason. So I'm guessing they're not really planned for long-term fun, just a short-term cash grab, if I might say so myself. But maybe they'll bring something out soon. And the only long-running game servers that I've seen in the Chinese market, I don't know, is Genshin Impact Chinese? Shit, I'm sorry. Yeah, Genshin Impact is MiHoYo, based in Shanghai, China. Okay. For some reason I thought MiHoYo was Japanese, but it's not. Yeah, so Lord of the Rings definitely gets that part. And I'll talk about a little bit about like some of the difficulties of MMOs and how Lord of the Rings will not have that problem. Because most of the time people think about large scale world regions where we already have dynamic loading, we have dynamic weather, we got player housing solved, large scale battles are solved. They have like different types of techniques like pooling and identical object creation that shares the same RAM. And then you have like different types of methods for resources. So like back then, the limitations were trying to make those large scale battles and having a very open world to explore. But I feel like all those things were solved, like with Crimson Desert, many things for an MMO could work. Like I feel like Crimson Desert was a really good experiment for what Pearl Abyss, right, could take to their next MMO if they're going to. Black Desert is very successful MMORPG, and maybe that's the more recent one, I guess. But they kind of started at the same time as Final Fantasy 14. It was only like a 2 or 3 year difference, so I guess we would just call it one of those 3 legendary MMOs, guys and girls: World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy 14, and Black Desert. I feel like are the 3 legendary MMOs of our time right now. The 3 big ones. Like I wouldn't really put it against if you invested so much time and effort into any of the 3 games. Those are masterpieces in my opinion. But I haven't really actually played World of Warcraft, but because like it's outdated for me. I prefer my games fresh, a little bit of freshness, you know, with the graphics. Well, here I am playing Fantasy PSO2NGS. It's already a 6-year-old game, which I hope Sega makes another Phantasy Star. Man, I don't see why they can't make, like, why can't we hire more people, guys and girls? Like, if I had $1 billion, I would be trying to make something amazing. I would just burn through that $1 billion or whatever in the most efficient way as possible to get an amazing MMO out. But I guess I'll never get to see that day in my lifetime here. So anyways, you know, that MMO would be really good. I don't really have much to say about that portion because it's already been done so many times, and we have many successful titles, like I mentioned, that could help Lord of the Rings come back. It doesn't have to exactly be Lord of the Rings. Like, maybe the campaign of the MMORPG could be Lord of the Rings trilogy, but then the post game could be whatever you want, right? So like a DLC could be based on the next upcoming spin-off or anything. Like, can you see how great of an idea that would be? And it could be live service, paid live service, you know, like Final Fantasy 14. Lord of the Rings could work that way. And then as the people that control the IP, they write more books, more shows, more novels. After you beat the main campaign, you know, after Return of the King, your main character can pivot into new stories and more adventures that drastically change Middle Earth. Because holy shit, isn't that would be such a crazy, amazing feeling. And with even newcomers getting introduced to the series, it can reinvigorate, you know, maybe some remasters of the movie. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard to remaster the original. It's just so good already. You know, that would just be a disservice to those people that put really a lot of effort into the original movies. Because I feel like you can't really capture that same type of feeling or vibe in modern technology, because it was just a mixture of everything with perfect balance, equilibrium. So for that, you know, with those many examples in the big 3 of MMOs, Lord of the Rings Online or whatever MMO, could definitely work. It's just you know, they're picking the right people, the right companies, but I feel like it could work tremendously and could definitely evolve the gaming market. Even though I'm still waiting for my Sword Art Online actual real virtual reality game. You know, there's a thing between isekai and fantasy, and then having isekai fantasy, man, that's a killer combo. So if somebody gave us unlimited money, I guess theoretically, you know, if you had $1 trillion at your disposal, and they told you to make the best Lord of the Rings RPG, MMO, RPG, whatever, how would you define Middle Earth? Or maybe name 2 games in your knowledge that you think combined would take Lord of the Rings franchise into the next level. Well, let me know. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts as well. So I'll just go quickly over this. You know, having to end with like your dream game And Lord of the Rings in general, I think Lord of the Rings is just a great example of what could be a great JRPG, RPG, MMO. I mean, if we take all of the other games, like say like World of Warcraft, and had the IP of Lord of the Rings in there, I mean, it would really work out. And I guess that's why it's not being made, because they don't really want to make another copy of a game, but just with different characters and whatnot, because maybe the story would collide as being the same. Which, yeah, it would make sense in that regards. But like, what companies would you think should take this big test? You know, should Pearl Abyss, and I don't want to put NC Soft in there. Maybe Pearl Abyss. I really don't know. I don't really know any really big MMORPGs in the USA. It's mostly just a lot of Southeast Asia or Asia in general that really make MMOs these days. But yeah, they could add things like the fellowship system, obviously guilds, maybe some sort of corruption dynamic, and then you can have like wars, kind of like the Node Wars in Black Desert. And I'm just repeating on and on. You know, they're basically saying that even from games like Shadow of War, they can incorporate into a way that turns it into an MMO, like the Nemesis system, like the Nemesis-like enemies, by expanding on it with the rivalries and the corrupted allies and all that, which was really fun. And then obviously the war system. So like, yeah, I feel like who's ever working on the next Lord of the Rings MMORPG or RPG, there is a future for it. It's just that I guess the amount of work needed and the amount of talent needed is just nowhere to be found, I guess. Yeah, well, what do you think? Do you think Lord of the Rings deserves an MMO title of a grand scale? Or do you think it's already been done too many times? Like with the big three, World of Warcraft, Black Desert, and Final Fantasy 14. Is the MMORPG genre dying? Are we just running out of money? Clearly, we're not running out of money because we have a lot of trillionaires. So, I think it's just a matter of people being very stingy. With that said, that'll be it for today's podcast of Walk Talking Rock. My final question for you all is, I guess, if you were to live in the Lord of the Rings world, which race or which character would you like to follow? You just let me know. Alright, and that'll be it. I'll see you in the next video.